The black Bentley pulled up to the grand gates of Buckingham Palace with the kind of confidence that only comes with old money. Behind the wheel sat Victoria Hartwell, a woman who had never heard the word no without finding a way to make it yes. At 42, she wore her wealth like armor, from her perfectly styled blonde hair to her diamond earrings that cost more than most people's cars. Victoria stepped out of her car, her designer heels clicking against the pavement with authority. Tonight was the annual Royal Heritage Charity Gala, and she had been looking forward to this event for months. Not because she cared about charity, mind you, but because it was the perfect place to remind everyone exactly who she was and what her family name meant in London's elite circles. The palace grounds were buzzing with activity. Expensive cars dropped off guests in glittering gowns and perfectly tailored tuxedos. Camera flashes went off as photographers captured the arrivals of various celebrities and wealthy donors. Victoria smiled to herself, knowing she looked better than most of the women walking up those steps. As she made her way toward the entrance, she noticed him. Standing perfectly still like a statue, dressed in the iconic red uniform with the tall black hat, was a royal guard. His name was Thomas Wright, though Victoria didn't know that, nor did she care to. To her, he was just part of the decorative background, like the fancy pillars or the golden gates. Thomas had been standing at his post for 2 hours already. At 28 years old, he had served the crown for 6 years with dedication and pride. His uniform was spotless, his posture perfect, and his face showed the kind of discipline that came from years of training. He took his duty seriously. Protecting the royal family and maintaining the dignity of the palace was not just his job. It was his calling. Victoria approached the entrance with her invitation clutched in her manicured hand, but she wasn't paying attention to where she was going. She was too busy looking around to see who else had arrived, mentally cataloging who she needed to speak with and who she could ignore. Her phone buzzed with a text from her assistant about tomorrow's spa appointment, and she stopped to read it right in front of Thomas. "Excuse me, ma'am," Thomas said politely, his voice calm and respectful. "May I please see your invitation?" Victoria looked up from her phone with the kind of expression someone might wear if they had just stepped in something unpleasant. She stared at Thomas as if he had just asked her to perform a circus trick. "I'm sorry, what did you just say to me?" she asked, her voice carrying that particular tone that wealthy people use when they want to remind others of their place in the world. Thomas remained perfectly professional. "I need to see your invitation before you can enter, ma'am. It's standard security protocol for all guests." Victoria let out a small laugh, the kind that wasn't meant to be funny. "Do you have any idea who I am?" "No, ma'am, but I still need to see your invitation," Thomas replied calmly. This was not how Victoria's evening was supposed to start. She was used to being recognized everywhere she went. Her family had been donating to royal charities for 3 generations. Her grandfather had been knighted by the Queen herself. The idea that this guard didn't immediately know who she was felt like a personal insult. "I am Victoria Hartwell," she announced, as if the name should cause him to step aside and possibly apologize. "The Hartwells? We've been supporting the royal family longer than you've been alive, young man." Thomas nodded politely but didn't move. "That's wonderful, ma'am. I still need to see your invitation." Other guests were starting to notice the holdup. A couple walking behind Victoria whispered to each other and moved to another entrance. A photographer turned his camera toward the scene, sensing potential drama. Victoria felt her cheeks flush with embarrassment, which only made her anger grow stronger. "This is absolutely ridiculous," she said, her voice getting louder. "I've been to this palace more times than I can count. I've had tea with members of the royal family. My family has donated millions to various charities connected to this place." Thomas maintained his position and his calm expression. "I understand, ma'am, but everyone needs to show their invitation. It's for the security of all the guests and the royal family." "Security?" Victoria practically spat the word. "From me? Do you think I'm some kind of threat?" She waved her hand dismissively at Thomas, her diamond bracelet catching the light from the palace windows. "I could buy and sell you 10 times over. My handbag cost more than you probably make in 6 months." Thomas said nothing. His training had taught him how to deal with difficult people, and he had seen his share of entitled guests over the years. But something about Victoria's tone and the way she was treating him struck him as particularly unpleasant. Still, he remained professional. "Ma'am, I'm just doing my job. If you could please show me your invitation, You'll be able to enter and enjoy the gala." Victoria fumbled in her purse, her movements sharp and angry. She found the elegant invitation with its gold lettering and royal seal, then thrust it toward Thomas with more force than necessary. "There. Are you happy now?" she demanded. Thomas examined the invitation carefully, as he did with every guest. It was genuine, and everything appeared to be in order. He handed it back to her with a slight nod. "Thank you, ma'am. Please enjoy your evening." But instead of walking away, Victoria stood there for a moment, staring at Thomas with pure hatred. In her mind, he had humiliated her in front of other guests. He had forced her to prove who she was, something that had never happened to her before. The fact that he had just been doing his job didn't matter to her. All that mattered was that a person she considered beneath her had dared to question her. "You know," she said, stepping closer to Thomas, "people like you need to learn some respect. Do you understand that without people like my family, people like you wouldn't even have jobs?" Thomas remained silent, staring straight ahead. His jaw tightened slightly, but he didn't respond to her comments. "I'm going to remember your face," Victoria continued, her voice low but filled with venom. "I have friends who could make your life very difficult if I wanted them to." She turned on her heel and started walking toward the palace entrance, but then stopped and looked back at Thomas one more time. The anger in her chest was still burning, and she couldn't shake the feeling that this guard had somehow gotten the better of her. In her world, that simply wasn't acceptable. The stage was set for what would become one of the most regrettable decisions of Victoria Hartwell's privileged life. As she walked into the palace, her anger continued to simmer, and Thomas continued to stand at his post, unaware that this unpleasant encounter was far from over. Inside the palace, Victoria tried to enjoy the gala, but she couldn't stop thinking about her encounter with the guard. Every time she sipped her champagne or made small talk with other guests, her mind wandered back to that moment when he had asked for her invitation. The more she thought about it, the angrier she became. The ballroom was magnificent, with crystal chandeliers casting golden light over the crowd of elegantly dressed guests. A string quartet played classical music in the corner, while waiters moved through the room with trays of expensive appetizers. Victoria should have been in her element, but instead she felt restless and irritated. "Victoria, darling," called out her friend Rebecca from across the room. "You look absolutely stunning tonight." Victoria forced a smile and air-kissed Rebecca's cheeks, but her heart wasn't in it. "Thank you, dear. Have you met the new ambassador yet?" As they chatted about trivial matters, Victoria found herself glancing toward the windows that overlooked the courtyard where Thomas was still standing guard. She could see his red uniform in the distance, and every time she spotted him, her anger flared up again. "Excuse me for just a moment," Victoria said to Rebecca, then walked toward the ladies' room. But instead of going inside, she stepped out onto a small balcony that had a better view of the courtyard. Thomas was still there, standing perfectly still, doing his job with the same professionalism he had shown her. But to Victoria, his calm demeanor felt like a personal attack. How dare he act like nothing had happened? How dare he go about his duties as if he hadn't just disrespected one of the most important guests at this event? Victoria's phone rang. It was her husband, Richard. "How's the gala going, love?" he asked. "Oh, it's fine," Victoria said, trying to sound normal. "The usual crowd, you know." "Good, good. Don't forget to speak with Lord Patterson about the hospital donation. We need to make sure our name is on that new wing." "Of course," Victoria replied, but she was barely listening. Her eyes were fixed on Thomas in the courtyard below. After ending the call, Victoria stayed on the balcony for several more minutes, watching Thomas and feeling her resentment grow stronger. In her mind, she began to create a story about what had happened. She convinced herself that Thomas had been deliberately disrespectful, that he had singled her out for harassment, that he had been trying to embarrass her in front of the other guests. The truth was much simpler. Thomas had treated her exactly the same way he treated every other guest. He had been polite, professional, and thorough. But Victoria's ego couldn't accept that simple reality. When she finally returned to the gala, Victoria found it impossible to concentrate on the conversations around her. Every laugh felt forced, every smile felt fake. She kept thinking about Thomas standing outside, probably feeling proud of himself for putting her in her place. "Are you all right, dear?" asked Mrs. Pemberton, an elderly woman who had known Victoria's family for decades. "You seem a bit distracted tonight." "I'm perfectly fine," Victoria snapped, then immediately tried to soften her tone. Sorry, I just had a rather unpleasant encounter with one of the guards outside. Some people really don't understand proper respect anymore. Mrs. Pemberton raised an eyebrow. Oh, what happened? Victoria launched into her version of the story, painting Thomas as a rude and disrespectful guard who had deliberately tried to humiliate her. With each telling, the story grew more dramatic. By the time she finished, she had convinced herself that Thomas had been openly hostile toward her. How terrible, Mrs. Pemberton said, though she looked a bit skeptical. The guards are usually so well trained. Well, this one clearly isn't, Victoria replied firmly. I have half a mind to file a complaint. As the evening went on, Victoria told her story to several other guests, each time making Thomas sound worse and her own treatment more unfair. Some people nodded sympathetically, while others seemed uncomfortable with her version of events, but Victoria was too wrapped up in her own anger to notice their reactions. By the time the main speeches began, Victoria had worked herself into a state of righteous fury. She stood in the back of the room, barely listening to the charity presentation, instead plotting how she might get revenge on the guard who had dared to treat her like a common person. The speeches seemed to go on forever. Victoria checked her watch repeatedly, tapping her foot impatiently. All she wanted was for this evening to end, so she could do something about the situation with Thomas. She had already decided that she would speak to someone in charge about his behavior. Maybe she would even demand that he be fired. When the formal part of the evening finally concluded, Victoria made her excuses to the other guests and headed for the exit. Her anger had been building for hours, and she was practically vibrating with rage by the time she stepped back into the courtyard. Thomas was still at his post, looking exactly the same as when she had first encountered him. His uniform was still perfect, his posture still straight, his expression still professional. To anyone else, he would have looked like the picture of a dedicated royal guard doing his duty. But to Victoria, his calm appearance was like gasoline on a fire. How dare he look so composed after what he had put her through? How dare he act like he had done nothing wrong? She walked directly toward him, her heels clicking loudly against the stone courtyard. Other guests were leaving the palace around her, saying their goodbyes and heading to their cars, but Victoria had only one thing on her mind. You, she said when she was close enough for Thomas to hear her. I want to talk to you. Thomas remained at attention, staring straight ahead. Ma'am, if you have a concern, you can speak to the duty officer inside the palace. Don't you dare tell me what I can and cannot do, Victoria hissed. You've already caused me enough embarrassment for one evening. A few other guests had noticed Victoria approaching the guard and slowed their departure to watch what was happening. Victoria was too angry to care about the audience she was creating. I want you to know, she continued, stepping even closer to Thomas, that your behavior tonight was absolutely unacceptable. Do you understand me? Thomas finally looked at her, his expression remaining neutral. Ma'am, I was simply following standard security procedures. If you have a complaint, please speak to my supervisor. Don't give me that nonsense, Victoria shot back. You know exactly what you did. You deliberately tried to embarrass me in front of the other guests. That was not my intention, ma'am, Thomas replied calmly. But his calm response only made Victoria angrier. She wanted him to react, to defend himself, to show some emotion that would justify the rage she was feeling. Instead, he just stood there being professional, which somehow felt like the ultimate insult. The confrontation was about to take a turn that would change both of their lives forever. The courtyard had grown quieter as more guests departed, but those who remained were now openly watching the heated exchange between Victoria and the royal guard. Word was spreading quickly among the departing guests that something dramatic was happening, and several people had stopped their conversations to observe the scene. Victoria could feel the eyes of the other guests on her, which only fueled her rage further. In her twisted logic, Thomas had not only embarrassed her earlier, but now he was making her look like a fool in front of everyone again simply by remaining calm and professional. Look at me when I'm talking to you, she demanded, her voice rising to a level that was clearly audible to everyone nearby. Thomas shifted his gaze to meet her eyes, maintaining the respectful but firm expression he had been trained to show in difficult situations. Ma'am, I am listening to your concerns. My concerns? Victoria let out a bitter laugh. You humiliated me earlier, and now you're standing here acting like you did nothing wrong. Do you think I'm stupid? No, ma'am, I don't think that at all, Thomas replied evenly. I was simply doing my job by checking your invitation as I do with every guest who enters the palace. Every guest? Victoria's voice cracked with incredulity. I saw you let other people walk right past you without checking anything. You specifically targeted me because you wanted to put me in my place. This wasn't true, of course. Thomas had been checking invitations consistently throughout the evening, just as he always did. But Victoria had become so convinced of her own version of events that she genuinely believed what she was saying. Ma'am, that's not accurate, Thomas said quietly. I check everyone's invitation. It's palace security protocol. Don't lie to me, Victoria shouted, causing several nearby guests to step back in shock. I know what I saw and I know what you did. You saw an opportunity to embarrass someone you thought was just another rich person, and you took it. Thomas remained silent for a moment, processing her accusation. He had dealt with difficult guests before, but never had someone been so convinced that he had acted inappropriately when he had simply followed standard procedures. Ma'am, he said carefully, I treat every guest with the same respect and follow the same security measures for everyone. I apologize if you felt singled out, but that was never my intention. His attempt at diplomacy backfired spectacularly. To Victoria, his apology sounded condescending, like he was talking down to a child who was having a tantrum. Her face flushed red with anger and embarrassment. How dare you, she whispered, her voice trembling with rage. How dare you stand there and patronize me? The small crowd of onlookers was growing larger. Some guests had pulled out their phones, though they were trying to be discreet about it. A few palace staff members had noticed the commotion and were making their way across the courtyard. But they were still several yards away. Victoria looked around at all the faces watching her, and something inside her snapped completely. She had spent her entire life being the most important person in any room, and now she was being made to look like a crazy woman having a public meltdown. In her mind, this was all Thomas's fault. You think you're so superior, don't you? She hissed, moving even closer to Thomas until she was almost nose to nose with him. Standing there in your fancy uniform, acting like you're some kind of hero. Thomas took a small step back, not out of fear, but to maintain appropriate distance. His movement was barely noticeable, but Victoria interpreted it as him trying to get away from her, which she saw as another sign of disrespect. Don't you dare step away from me, she snarled. I'm not finished talking to you. Ma'am, perhaps we should continue this conversation with my supervisor present, Thomas suggested, his voice still calm but with a slight edge of concern creeping in. No, Victoria said flatly. We're going to finish this right here, right now. You're going to admit that you deliberately tried to humiliate me, and then you're going to apologize properly. Ma'am, I cannot admit to something I didn't do, Thomas replied. I followed proper protocol with you just as I do with every guest. That was the final straw for Victoria. The combination of his refusal to back down, the growing crowd of witnesses, and her own spiraling emotions created a perfect storm of rage. She felt completely out of control, and in that moment she wanted nothing more than to wipe the calm, professional expression off Thomas's face. You arrogant little man, she spat. You think your uniform makes you untouchable? You think you can treat people like me however you want and get away with it? Thomas opened his mouth to respond, but before he could say a word, Victoria's hand flew through the air. The slap connected with his left cheek with a sharp crack that echoed across the stone courtyard like a gunshot. The sound was so loud and unexpected that several people in the crowd gasped audibly. A woman near the palace entrance actually screamed. Time seemed to freeze for a moment as everyone processed what had just happened. Thomas's head jerked slightly from the impact, and a bright red handprint began to form on his cheek, but he didn't raise his hand to touch it. He didn't step back. He didn't even blink. His training had taught him to remain composed no matter what happened, and even in this shocking moment, his discipline held firm. Victoria stood there breathing heavily, her hand still raised slightly from the follow-through of the slap. For just a moment she felt a rush of satisfaction. Finally, she had gotten a reaction. Finally, she had shown this arrogant guard that he couldn't treat her with disrespect. But as she looked at Thomas's face, she saw something that made her stomach drop. He wasn't angry or shocked or hurt. He was looking at her with something that looked almost like pity, and his expression remained as professional as ever, despite the angry red mark on his cheek. It was in that moment that Victoria began to realize the magnitude of what she had just done. The courtyard was dead silent except for the sound of her own heavy breathing. Every single person within 50 yards was staring at her with expressions of shock and disgust. She had just struck a member of the Queen's Guard in front of dozens of witnesses. The satisfaction she had felt just seconds earlier evaporated, replaced by a cold dread that started in her stomach and spread throughout her entire body. Thomas finally spoke, his voice still steady despite what had just happened to him. "Ma'am, I need to report this incident to my supervisors." Victoria opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. She looked around at the crowd of people staring at her, at the palace staff members who were now rushing toward them, at the phones that were definitely recording everything. For the first time in her life, Victoria Hartwell realized that her money and her family name might not be enough to save her from the consequences of her actions. The silence that followed the slap lasted only seconds, but to Victoria, it felt like an eternity. Then suddenly everything happened at once. Palace security officers appeared as if from nowhere, their radios crackling with urgent communications. The first to arrive was Sergeant Williams, a veteran officer who had seen many incidents in his 20 years of service, but nothing quite like this. "Step back, ma'am," Sergeant Williams said firmly to Victoria, positioning himself between her and Thomas. "Everyone else, please move away and give us some space." Victoria finally found her voice, though it came out as more of a croak. "This is all a misunderstanding. He was being disrespectful to me and I just—" "Ma'am, you need to remain silent until we can sort this out," Sergeant Williams interrupted. He turned to Thomas, whose cheek was now visibly swollen. "Are you injured, Officer Wright?" Thomas touched his cheek briefly, then shook his head. "I'm fine, sir. Just a bit tender." More security personnel arrived, along with palace staff, who began politely but firmly moving the gathered guests away from the scene. Victoria watched in growing horror as the crowd dispersed, many of them whispering to each other and stealing glances back at her. "I need to see some identification," Sergeant Williams said to Victoria. With shaking hands, Victoria fumbled for her purse and pulled out her driver's license. The confident woman who had arrived at the palace just hours earlier was gone, replaced by someone who looked pale and frightened. "Mrs. Victoria Hartwell," Sergeant Williams read aloud, making notes in a small notebook. "And you are a guest at tonight's charity gala?" "Yes, of course I am," Victoria said, her voice getting stronger as she tried to regain some composure. "Look, this whole thing has been blown completely out of proportion. I'm sure we can resolve this quietly." Sergeant Williams looked at her with the kind of expression that suggested he had heard similar requests many times before. "Ma'am, you've just assaulted a member of the Queen's Guard in full view of multiple witnesses. This is a serious criminal matter." The word criminal hit Victoria like a physical blow. She had never been in trouble with the law in her entire life. The closest she had ever come to legal issues was a speeding ticket that her lawyer had made disappear with a phone call. "Criminal?" she repeated, her voice rising. "That's ridiculous. It was just a slap. He's perfectly fine." "Ma'am, assault is assault regardless of the level of injury," Sergeant Williams explained patiently. "And assaulting a member of the Royal Guard carries particularly serious consequences." Meanwhile, other officers were interviewing witnesses and reviewing footage from the palace's extensive security camera system. The entire incident had been captured in high definition from multiple angles, leaving no room for doubt about what had happened. Victoria's phone started ringing. She glanced at the screen and saw her husband's name. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely answer it. "Richard," she whispered. "Victoria, what on earth is going on? I just got a call from Charles Morrison saying you've been involved in some kind of incident at the palace." Victoria looked around at the security officers, the remaining staff, and Thomas, who was now being examined by a palace medical officer. There's been a situation. Can you come down here?" "What kind of situation?" "Victoria, you're scaring me. Just come, please," she said before hanging up. Detective Inspector Sarah Chen arrived on the scene 20 minutes later. As the lead investigator for crimes involving palace security, she had been called in to handle the case. Victoria watched nervously as the detective spoke quietly with Sergeant Williams and reviewed the security footage on a tablet. "Mrs. Hartwell," Detective Inspector Chen said, approaching Victoria with a professional but serious expression, "I'm going to need you to come with me for questioning." "Questioning?" Victoria's voice cracked. "But I'm the victim here. That guard was completely inappropriate with me earlier this evening." We'll certainly look into all aspects of what happened tonight, Detective Inspector Chen said calmly. But right now I need to speak with you about the assault that was witnessed by approximately 30 people and recorded by multiple security cameras. Victoria felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. This couldn't be happening. Things like this didn't happen to people like her. She was Victoria Hartwell. Her family had connections throughout London's elite circles. Surely someone could make this whole mess disappear. I want to call my lawyer, she said. That's your right, Detective Inspector Chen replied. You can make that call once we get to the station. The station? Victoria's voice came out as a squeak. You're arresting me? You're being detained for questioning in connection with an assault, the detective explained. We'll determine the formal charges after we've completed our investigation. As if in a nightmare, Victoria found herself being led away from the palace in the back of an unmarked police car. Through the window, she could see Thomas speaking with investigators, his red uniform jacket removed so the medical officer could get a better look at his injury. The drive to the police station was the longest 15 minutes of Victoria's life. She kept expecting someone to call and say it had all been a mistake, that charges were being dropped, that she could go home and pretend this had never happened. But her phone remained silent. At the station, Victoria was processed like any other suspect. Her fingerprints were taken, her photo was snapped, and her personal belongings were cataloged and stored. The officer handling her intake was polite but businesslike, treating her exactly like any other person who had been brought in for assault. This is insane, Victoria muttered as she was led to an interview room. Do you people have any idea who I am? The officer, a young constable who looked like he couldn't be more than 25, glanced at her paperwork. Yes, ma'am. You're Victoria Hartwell, age 42, charged with assault on a Crown officer. Victoria sat in the sterile interview room for what felt like hours, though the clock on the wall told her it had only been 30 minutes. When Detective Inspector Chen finally entered with a file folder and a recording device, Victoria was ready to explode with frustration. This whole thing is a massive overreaction, Victoria began before the detective had even sat down. I barely touched him. He's fine. And besides, he was completely inappropriate with me first. Detective Inspector Chen set up the recording equipment and stated the time, date, and participants for the record. Then she looked directly at Victoria. Mrs. Hartwell, I've reviewed the security footage from tonight's incident. I've also spoken with multiple witnesses. Before we go any further, I want to make sure you understand the seriousness of what you're facing. Victoria stared back at her, trying to project confidence she didn't feel. I understand that this whole situation has been blown completely out of proportion. Assault on a Crown officer is a serious criminal offense, Detective Inspector Chen continued. It carries a potential sentence of up to 6 months in prison and a substantial fine. More importantly, for someone in your position, it will result in a permanent criminal record. The words hit Victoria like cold water. A criminal record, prison. These were things that happened to other people, not to someone like her. For the first time since the incident began, Victoria Hartwell started to understand that her privileged life was about to change forever. The interview room at Westminster Police Station was nothing like the luxurious environments Victoria was accustomed to. The walls were painted a dull beige, the fluorescent lighting was harsh, and the metal chair she sat in was uncomfortable and cold. For someone who had never spent more than 5 minutes in any government building that wasn't decorated with crystal chandeliers, the stark reality of her situation was beginning to sink in. Detective Inspector Chen opened her file and spread several photographs across the table. They were still images taken from the palace security cameras, showing Victoria's confrontation with Thomas from multiple angles. In one particularly clear shot, her hand was captured mid-swing, just before it made contact with Thomas's face. Mrs. Hartwell, the detective began. These images were taken from the palace security system. As you can see, they show the entire incident from start to finish. Would you like to tell me in your own words what led up to this moment? Victoria stared at the photographs, and for the first time, she saw the scene from an outside perspective. In the images, Thomas looked calm and professional, while she appeared angry and aggressive. The contrast was stark and undeniable. He was being disrespectful, Victoria said quietly, though her voice lacked the conviction it had carried earlier. When I arrived at the palace, he singled me out and tried to embarrass me in front of the other guests. How did he single you out? Detective Inspector Chen asked, making notes in her file. He demanded to see my invitation when he was letting other people walk right past him, Victoria replied. But even as she said it, she could hear how weak the excuse sounded. Detective Inspector Chen pulled out another set of photographs. These showed Thomas checking invitations with various guests throughout the evening. In every single image, he was following the same procedure, asking to see invitations and examining them carefully. These images show Officer Wright checking invitations with 17 different guests over the course of the evening, the detective said calmly. In every case, he followed the exact same procedure. Can you explain why you felt you were being treated differently? Victoria looked at the photos and felt something crumble inside her chest. The evidence was right there in front of her, undeniable and clear. Thomas hadn't singled her out. He hadn't been disrespectful. He had simply been doing his job exactly as he was trained to do. I thought, she began, then stopped. What could she say? That she had expected special treatment because of her family name? That she had never been asked to prove who she was before? That she had been so outraged by being treated like everyone else that she had lost control completely? Mrs. Hartwell, Detective Inspector Chen said gently, I've also spoken with several witnesses who observed your interaction with Officer Wright, both at the beginning of the evening and during the final confrontation. Their statements are remarkably consistent. The detective opened another folder and began reading from witness statements. Guest after guest described seeing Victoria become increasingly agitated, shouting at Thomas, and finally striking him while he remained calm and professional throughout the entire encounter. According to these witnesses, Detective Inspector Chen continued, Officer Wright never raised his voice, never used inappropriate language, and never deviated from standard security protocols. Multiple people described his behavior as exemplary and professional. Victoria felt tears beginning to form in her eyes, though she fought hard to hold them back. Her entire version of events was falling apart under the weight of evidence and witness testimony. I want to speak to my lawyer, she said quietly. Of course, Detective Inspector Chen replied. You're entitled to legal representation. 20 minutes later, Victoria found herself on the phone with her family's longtime solicitor, Harold Pemberton. She had known Harold since childhood. He had handled everything from her parents' estate planning to her own divorce proceedings years earlier. If anyone could make this nightmare go away, it would be him. Victoria, my dear, Harold's familiar voice came through the phone. I've already heard about the situation. I'm afraid this is quite serious. Harold, you have to do something, Victoria pleaded. This whole thing is a misunderstanding that's gotten completely out of hand. There was a long pause before Harold responded. Victoria, I've seen the security footage. The palace has already provided copies to the police as part of their cooperation with the investigation. What exactly am I supposed to do with clear video evidence of you striking a royal guard? Victoria felt her last hope beginning to slip away. Can't you make this go away? Use our family connections? Call in some favors? Victoria, Harold said sadly, this isn't a traffic ticket or a noise complaint. You've assaulted a Crown officer in front of dozens of witnesses. There's no making this go away. Back in the interview room, Detective Inspector Chen continued her methodical review of the evidence. She showed Victoria statements from palace staff, security personnel, and guests who had witnessed the incident. She presented a medical report documenting the injury to Thomas's face. She even had audio recordings from the palace's security system that had captured Victoria's increasingly hostile language throughout the confrontation. Mrs. Hartwell, the detective said after reviewing all the evidence, I want to give you an opportunity to explain your actions. Is there anything you'd like to tell me about why this situation escalated the way it did? Victoria sat in silence for several minutes, staring at the table. The weight of evidence against her was overwhelming, and she was beginning to understand that no amount of money or family connections was going to save her from the consequences of her actions. I lost my temper, she finally admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Can you elaborate on that? Detective Inspector Chen asked. Victoria took a shaky breath. I'm not used to being questioned or treated like everyone else. When he asked for my invitation, I felt like he was disrespecting me. I got angry, and instead of just walking away, I kept making it worse. And what about the actual assault? The detective pressed. What was going through your mind when you struck Officer Wright? Victoria closed her eyes, remembering that moment when her hand had flown through the air. I wanted to hurt him. I wanted to wipe that calm expression off his face. I wanted him to react the way I was reacting. It was the first completely honest thing she had said since the incident began. Detective Inspector Chen made more notes in her file. Mrs. Hartwell, based on the evidence we've collected and your own admission, I'm formally charging you with assault on a Crown officer. You'll be released on bail pending your court appearance, but I need to make clear that this is a serious criminal charge. As Victoria was processed for release, she caught a glimpse of the evening news playing on a television in the station's waiting area. The reporter was standing outside Buckingham Palace, and the headline at the bottom of the screen read, "Wealthy socialite assaults royal guard at Palace Charity Gala." Her mugshot flashed on the screen, followed by footage that someone had obviously taken with their phone during the incident. Victoria watched in horror as she saw herself shouting at Thomas and then striking him while he stood, perfectly still and professional. The reporter was describing her as a member of London's elite who apparently felt that the rules didn't apply to her. The story was already spreading across social media, with the hashtag #DashnerPalaceSlap trending on various platforms. Victoria's carefully constructed life of privilege and respect was crumbling in real time, broadcast to millions of people, who would now forever remember her as the woman who lost control and attacked a royal guard as she walked out of the police station to find her husband waiting anxiously by his car. Victoria realized that her real punishment was just beginning. Victoria's husband Richard was waiting outside the police station when she was finally released, his face a mixture of concern, confusion, and barely controlled anger. As they drove home through the London streets in tense silence, Victoria could see people on their phones at bus stops and in cafes, many of them watching what she assumed was footage of her confrontation with Thomas. 40 years, Richard finally said as they pulled into their driveway in Kensington. 40 years I've known you, Victoria, and I never thought I'd be picking you up from a police station. Victoria couldn't look at him. The grand Georgian mansion that had always felt like a sanctuary now seemed to loom over her accusingly. Even their own home felt different somehow, as if her actions had tainted everything around her. Inside, their housekeeper, Mrs. Davies, greeted them with an expression that was carefully neutral. But Victoria could see the judgment in her eyes. News traveled fast in their social circle, and she had no doubt that every member of their household staff had already heard what happened. "Mrs. Hartwell," Mrs. Davies said quietly, "there have been several reporters calling the house phone. I told them you weren't available for comment." Reporters. Victoria's stomach dropped even further. She had been so focused on the legal consequences that she hadn't fully considered how public this would become. Richard led her into his study and closed the door behind them. "Tell me exactly what happened tonight," he said, his voice carefully controlled. Victoria collapsed into one of the leather armchairs and finally began to cry. Not the delicate tears of a sophisticated woman, but the ugly, overwhelming sobs of someone whose entire world was falling apart. Between tears, she told Richard everything. How she had felt disrespected by Thomas's request to see her invitation. How her anger had built throughout the evening. How she had convinced herself that he had deliberately singled her out for humiliation. How she had completely lost control and struck him in front of dozens of witnesses. Richard listened without interruption, his face growing more grave with each detail. When she finished, he sat in silence for several minutes. "Victoria," he said finally, "do you understand what you've done? Not just to yourself, but to our family, to our reputation, to our business?" The Hartwell name was connected to Richard's successful investment firm, which managed money for some of London's wealthiest families. Their social connections were crucial to his business relationships. Victoria's public disgrace would inevitably damage everything they had built together. "It'll blow over," Victoria said weakly, though she didn't believe it herself. "These things always do." Richard shook his head. "Have you seen the internet? This isn't going to blow over. You're trending on social media. There are memes being made about you. Someone has already set up a fan page for the guard you attacked." He pulled out his laptop and showed her what the rest of the world was seeing. The hashtag #DashnerPalaceSlap had indeed gone viral, with thousands of people sharing the video and expressing their outrage at Victoria's behavior. There were comments calling her entitled, privileged, and out of touch. Worse, people had already started digging into her background, sharing details about her family wealth and social connections. One particularly viral tweet read, "This is what happens when someone has never heard the word no in their entire life. Respect to the guard for maintaining his professionalism while being assaulted by this entitled woman." Victoria's phone started ringing. The caller ID showed her friend Rebecca from the gala. "Don't answer it," Richard said quietly. But the calls kept coming. Friends, acquaintances, business associates, even distant relatives. Victoria's phone buzzed constantly with calls and text messages, most of which she was afraid to read. The next morning, Victoria woke up to find photographers camped outside their house. The story had made the front page of several newspapers, with headlines like "Palace Slapper, Socialite's Meltdown Caught on Camera," and "The Woman Who Struck the Crown Inside Victoria. Hartwell's Night of Shame." Richard brought her coffee and the morning papers with a grim expression. "It's worse than I thought," he said. "The Telegraph is calling for your prosecution to the fullest extent of the law. The Guardian has written an opinion piece about privilege and accountability. Even the international press has picked up the story." Victoria stared at a photograph of herself mid-slap on the front page of The Sun. The image captured perfectly the moment when her carefully maintained facade had crumbled completely, revealing the ugly, entitled rage beneath. Her phone rang again. This time it was her mother, Victoria Elizabeth Hartwell. Her mother's voice was ice cold. "What have you done to our family name? Mother, I've had to unplug my phone because of the reporters calling. The chairman of the hospital board has already called to discuss your position on the charity committee. Do you understand what you've done?" Victoria had been on the board of 3 different charities, positions that had given her purpose and social standing. She had never considered that those roles might be at risk. "Surely they won't." "They absolutely will," her mother interrupted. "Would you want someone with a criminal record representing your organization? Someone who's become a laughingstock on the internet?" The calls and emails started arriving by mid-morning. First, it was the Children's Hospital Foundation, regretfully accepting her resignation from the board due to the negative publicity. Then the Royal Opera House, politely suggesting she step down from the fundraising committee. Finally, the Kennel Club, where she had been a member for 15 years, informed her that her membership was under review. Richard's business was suffering too. By noon, 3 clients had called to express concerns about the negative publicity surrounding the Hartwell name. One had already indicated they were considering moving their accounts elsewhere. "I need to go to the office and try to manage this crisis," Richard said, straightening his tie. "I suggest you stay inside today. The photographers are still out there, and anything you say or do will only make things worse." But Victoria couldn't just hide in her house. She needed to do something, anything, to fix this situation. Against Richard's advice, she decided to call her old friend Catherine, who worked in public relations. "Victoria." Catherine's voice was sympathetic but professional. "I've been watching this story develop. I have to be honest with you. This is going to be very difficult to manage." "There must be something we can do," Victoria pleaded. "Some way to change the narrative to show my side of the story." "What is your side of the story?" Catherine asked bluntly. "Because from where I'm sitting, the video shows you verbally berating and then physically assaulting a man who was just doing his job. What possible spin could make that look better?" Victoria sat in her kitchen, surrounded by the luxury that had always insulated her from the consequences of her actions, and finally began to understand the full scope of what she had lost in those few moments of rage. Her reputation was destroyed. Her social standing was gone. Her marriage was strained. Her family name was tarnished. Even her charity work, which had given her life meaning and purpose, was being stripped away, all because she couldn't accept being treated like everyone else for 5 minutes. The woman who had woken up yesterday morning as a respected member of London society had become, in less than 24 hours, a cautionary tale about privilege and entitlement that would be discussed and analyzed for years to come. And the worst part was, she had no one to blame but herself. 3 months after the incident at Buckingham Palace, Victoria found herself standing in Westminster Magistrates' Court, facing the consequences of her actions. The woman who had once commanded respect in London's elite social circles now stood in the dock as a defendant, her expensive legal team unable to change the simple fact that she had assaulted a Crown officer in front of dozens of witnesses. The courtroom was packed with journalists, Legal observers and curious members of the public who had followed the case since the video first went viral. Victoria could feel their eyes on her as she sat beside her barrister, trying to maintain some semblance of dignity despite the circumstances. Her legal team, led by one of London's most expensive criminal defense solicitors, had spent weeks trying to find an angle that might reduce her sentence. They had considered arguing temporary insanity, claiming she had been under unusual stress. They had looked into challenging the video evidence somehow. They had even explored the possibility of claiming Thomas had provoked her through subtle disrespect that the cameras hadn't captured. But in the end, the evidence was simply too clear and overwhelming. Multiple camera angles, dozens of witnesses, and Victoria's own admission during police questioning had left them with only one strategy: throw themselves on the mercy of the court and hope for leniency. Magistrate Johnson, a stern woman in her 60s, who had seen every type of case imaginable, reviewed the files spread before her with careful attention. She had watched the security footage multiple times and read through all the witness statements. This was not a complex case legally, but it had certainly generated an unusual amount of public interest. "Mrs. Hartwell," Magistrate Johnson said, "you stand charged with assault on a Crown officer, specifically Officer Thomas Wright of the Queen's Guard, on the evening of March 15th. How do you plead?" Victoria's barrister stood up. "Guilty, Your Honor." The plea had been negotiated weeks earlier. Victoria's legal team had advised her that fighting the charges would be pointless given the evidence and might actually result in a harsher sentence. A guilty plea combined with expressions of remorse and a previously clean criminal record offered the best chance for a lighter punishment. "Very well," Magistrate Johnson said, making notes in the file. "Before I proceed to sentencing, I'd like to hear from the victim. Officer Wright, would you please approach the bench?" Thomas walked forward in his dress uniform, moving with the same quiet dignity he had shown throughout the entire ordeal. He had been promoted to corporal in the weeks following the incident, partly due to the exemplary professionalism he had demonstrated under extraordinary circumstances. "Corporal Wright," Magistrate Johnson said, "you have the opportunity to provide a victim impact statement. How has this incident affected you?" Thomas stood at attention as he spoke. "Your Honor, the physical injury was minor and healed quickly. However, the incident has had other effects. I've received a lot of attention, both positive and negative, which has been difficult for someone who prefers to serve quietly. My family has been concerned about my safety after some people posted my personal information online." He paused for a moment, then continued. "However, I want to say that I don't harbor any personal ill will toward Mrs. Hartwell. I believe she made a mistake in a moment of anger, and I hope this experience helps her grow as a person." Victoria felt tears welling up in her eyes at Thomas's generous words. Even now, after everything she had put him through, he was showing more grace and dignity than she had ever displayed in her privileged life. Magistrate Johnson made more notes, then looked at Victoria's barrister. "Does the defense wish to present any mitigation before sentencing?" Victoria's barrister stood and began presenting the case they had prepared. He spoke about Victoria's previously clean record, her charitable work, and the genuine remorse she had expressed since the incident. He mentioned the public humiliation she had already endured and the damage to her reputation and relationships. "Your Honor," the barrister concluded, "Mrs. Hartwell is not a career criminal or someone who poses an ongoing threat to public safety. She is a woman who made a terrible mistake in a moment of poor judgment, and she has already paid a significant price for that mistake." Then it was time for Victoria herself to speak. She had spent weeks preparing these words with her legal team, but as she stood up in the dock, her carefully rehearsed speech seemed inadequate. "Your Honor," she began, her voice shaking slightly, "I am deeply ashamed of my actions on that evening. There is no excuse for what I did to Corporal Wright. He was simply doing his job with professionalism and courtesy, and I responded with anger and violence." She paused to compose herself. "I have spent these past months reflecting on how I could have behaved so badly. I realize now that I had lived my entire life expecting special treatment because of my family name and wealth. When I was treated like everyone else, I couldn't handle it." Victoria looked directly at Thomas as she continued. "Corporal Wright showed incredible restraint and dignity throughout our encounter, while I showed none. He is a credit to his uniform and his country, and I am deeply sorry for the pain and embarrassment I caused him." Magistrate Johnson listened carefully to Victoria's statement, then spent several minutes reviewing her notes before beginning to deliver the sentence. "Mrs. Hartwell," she said, "assault on a Crown officer is a serious offense that strikes at the heart of our system of law and order. The men and women who serve as Royal Guards do so with dedication and professionalism, often under difficult circumstances. They deserve our respect and protection, not our violence." Victoria felt her knees go weak as she waited for the judgment. "However," Magistrate Johnson continued, "I also note that this appears to be completely out of character for you. You have no prior criminal record. You have been involved in charitable work and you have expressed genuine remorse for your actions. Most importantly, Corporal Wright himself has spoken generously about you despite what you put him through." The magistrate paused to consult her notes one final time. "I sentence you to 4 months in prison, suspended for 18 months, meaning you will not go to jail unless you commit another offense during that period. You will also perform 200 hours of community service, specifically working with military veterans charities, and pay a fine of £5,000 plus court costs." Victoria nearly collapsed with relief. She had been prepared for the possibility of immediate imprisonment, and while the sentence was still serious, it was far less severe than it could have been. "Additionally," Magistrate Johnson continued, "you will be placed on probation for 18 months, during which time you will attend anger management counseling and perform your community service under supervision." As Victoria left the courthouse that day, flanked by her legal team and surrounded by photographers, she understood that while she had avoided prison, her real punishment was far from over. The suspended sentence meant she would be living under the threat of imprisonment for the next year and a half. Any mistake, any loss of temper, any brush with the law would send her directly to jail. More importantly, she now had a permanent criminal record. The woman who had once looked down on people with criminal backgrounds had become one of them herself. But perhaps most significantly, she was about to begin 200 hours of community service with military veterans, where she would meet people who truly understood the meaning of service, sacrifice, and honor, qualities that had been so glaringly absent from her own behavior on that fateful night at Buckingham Palace. 6 months into her community service at the Thames Valley Veterans Support Center, Victoria was kneeling on the floor of a storage room, organizing donated winter coats by size. Her manicured nails were chipped, her designer clothes had been replaced by practical work attire, and her perfectly styled hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail. She looked nothing like the woman who had strutted into Buckingham Palace that fateful night. "Victoria, could you help me move these boxes to the main hall?" called out Frank, a 70-year-old former sergeant who managed the donation center. Frank had lost his left leg in Northern Ireland 30 years earlier, but he still worked 6 days a week helping other veterans get back on their feet. "Of course," Victoria replied, genuinely eager to help. The transformation in her attitude would have shocked anyone who had known her before the incident. The woman who had once believed that physical work was beneath her now found satisfaction in tasks she would have previously delegated to household staff. Over the past months, Victoria had met dozens of veterans who were struggling with homelessness, disability, unemployment, and mental health issues. She had listened to their stories, served them meals, helped them fill out benefit applications, and slowly begun to understand what real hardship looked like. There was David, a former Royal Marine who had served 3 tours in Afghanistan before returning home with severe PTSD. He had been living on the streets for 2 years when Victoria first met him, suspicious of everyone and angry at a world that seemed to have forgotten his service. There was Patricia, a former Army medic who had been discharged after suffering a spinal injury in a training accident. She was fighting a years-long battle with the Department of Veterans Affairs while trying to support 2 young children on disability benefits that barely covered rent. There was James, a young man who had lost both legs to an IED in Iraq and was struggling to rebuild his life while dealing with chronic pain and depression. These people had given everything in service to their country, yet many of them had been forgotten by the society they had sworn to protect. They faced their challenges with a quiet dignity that reminded Victoria constantly of Thomas's behavior on that night at the palace. "You know," Frank said as they carried boxes together, "when you first started here, I thought you were just another rich person doing community service to make themselves feel better." Victoria looked at him with curiosity. "What changed your mind?" Frank smiled. You actually listen to people. You remember their names, their stories. You show up every week, even when you're sick or tired. That's not something you can fake for 6 months. Victoria had indeed been transformed by her time at the center. The anger management counseling had helped her understand the root causes of her explosive behavior. But it was the daily exposure to people who had faced real adversity with grace that had truly changed her perspective. She had learned that Thomas's calm professionalism wasn't unusual among those who had served in the military. It was the result of training, discipline, and a deep understanding of duty that she had never possessed. The veterans she worked with displayed the same qualities every day as they faced challenges far greater than anything she had ever encountered. One particularly meaningful moment had come 3 months into her service when David, the former Marine with PTSD, had finally agreed to enter a treatment program. Victoria had spent weeks building trust with him, bringing him coffee, sitting with him during his panic attacks, and gradually convincing him to accept help. "You're not like other posh people," he had told her the day before entering treatment. "You actually give a damn about us." Victoria had gone home that night and cried for an hour, not from sadness but from a deep sense of purpose she had never felt during her years of charity galas and committee meetings. Her marriage to Richard had survived, though it had required months of counseling and honest conversations about their privileged lifestyle. Richard had been forced to rebuild some of his business relationships, and while they had lost some clients, others had actually respected his willingness to stand by his wife while holding her accountable for her actions. Victoria's relationship with her mother had been more complicated. The elder Mrs. Hartwell had eventually forgiven her daughter, but their conversations were different now. The casual gossip and social climbing that had once dominated their talks had been replaced by discussions about Victoria's community service and the veterans she was helping. Most of her former friends had drifted away, unable or unwilling to associate with someone who had become a public symbol of entitled behavior. But Victoria found she didn't miss most of those relationships. They had been based on social status rather than genuine connection, and their absence had made room for more meaningful friendships with people like Frank and the other volunteers at the center. The most difficult part of Victoria's journey had been writing a letter to Thomas. Her counselor had suggested it as part of her process of making amends, but Victoria had struggled for weeks to find the right words. How do you apologize to someone whose life you disrupted simply because your ego couldn't handle being treated like everyone else? How do you express remorse for behavior that was so fundamentally wrong that it had taken months of therapy to fully understand it? In the end, Victoria had written a simple, honest letter. "Dear Corporal Wright, I know that no words can undo what I did to you that night at Buckingham Palace. My behavior was inexcusable, and I take full responsibility for my actions. You showed incredible professionalism and dignity throughout our encounter, while I showed neither. I have spent the past year working with military veterans, and through them I have begun to understand the true meaning of service and sacrifice. You and they represent the best of what people can be, while I represented some of the worst. I do not expect your forgiveness, nor do I deserve it. I simply wanted you to know that I understand now how wrong I was, and that I am working every day to become a better person. With deepest regret and respect, Victoria Hartwell." Thomas had responded with a brief but gracious note, thanking her for the letter, and expressing hope that her community service was helping her grow as a person. He mentioned that he had been promoted again and was now training new guards, always emphasizing the importance of maintaining dignity and professionalism, even under difficult circumstances. As Victoria's probation period came to an end, she found herself at a crossroads. Her community service requirement was complete, but she had no desire to stop volunteering at the Veterans Center. The work had given her life a purpose and meaning that all her previous charitable activities had lacked. She had also begun speaking at schools and community groups about the dangers of entitlement and the importance of treating everyone with respect, regardless of their position in society. Her story had become a cautionary tale, but also one of redemption and growth. The woman who had once believed that her family name and wealth exempted her from the rules that governed everyone else had learned a fundamental truth. Respect cannot be bought or inherited. It must be earned through one's actions and character. Victoria would never again be the person she was before that night at Buckingham Palace. The entitled socialite who had felt superior to a royal guard simply doing his job was gone forever. In her place was someone who understood that true nobility comes not from birth or wealth but from how we treat others, especially those who cannot defend themselves. Standing in the Veterans Center that day, surrounded by people who had served their country with honor, Victoria realized that her greatest shame had ultimately led to her greatest growth. She had lost her old life of privilege and superficial respect, but she had gained something infinitely more valuable: genuine humility, real purpose, and the knowledge that every person, regardless of their station in life, deserves to be treated with basic human dignity. The slap that had destroyed her reputation in seconds had taken a year to truly understand, but it had ultimately made her into the person she should have been all along.